Welcome to Weekend Office Hours. My name is Sirish Pulusani. Welcome, Professor Paul Deneri. And every weekend, of course, we get together. We talk about the latest events happening in Ukraine. And it seems just the general zeitgeist, the general sense in the air is that the threat of nuclear war has gone up significantly. There is an argument being made that because Putin is being pushed into a corner right now, the likelihood of him dropping a tactical nuke is increased significantly. What is your take on this?
The short answer is, the risk has gone up. Now, we shouldn't, I don't want to be too picky about word use, but Putin is not being pushed into a corner, right? Putin has put himself in a corner very deliberately. I mean, right, not just in the sense that he decided to throw this war, but this annexation was a deliberate tactic, right, to make it harder for him to back down, right? So this is all part of a strategy of commitment, bluff, right, to try to get somebody else to back down. That being said, he has maybe put himself in more of a corner, and that does make it more likely that he would use nuclear weapons as a way to try to get out of it. Now, I think there are a lot of big questions to ask about how nuclear weapons get him out of it and whether they do. But let's take one thing at a time.
No, Paul, let's get to that actually, because the essential, I think the essence of the argument is, yes, I mean, Putin kind of put himself in this situation, but if Ukraine keeps on scoring battlefield victories, and neither of them come to the negotiation table, as Elon Musk proposed, and we'll talk about that later, then that's what puts Putin in this precarious position. It's an existential threat to him, and then he has no choice but to drop a nuclear weapon, a tactical nuke, which is going to be devastating for Ukraine in general. Do you feel like that's the case?
Not necessarily, which is Putin always has a choice, right? In the art of this kind of negotiation, and war is always a negotiation, or almost always a negotiation. Part of the art is to say, I have no choice, therefore you have to back down. And in a way, that's what's been happening in this conflict since 1991, is someone saying, no, I can't back down, you have to back down. And so we're still very much in the same spot. And I keep on saying we should do this, right? One of these days we should really dig into the game theory on this. There's some great game theory back from the Cold War era. But the basic idea is this is exactly what he's trying to do, is to say, I can't change policy, so you have to. But we do not have to accept his definition of the problem.
But does it put Ukraine in a precarious position then? Because, I mean, Ukraine is not under the nuclear embargo. So essentially, if Russia attacks Ukraine, this is a gamble in the sense Putin would take a gamble that the West will not respond, respond with anything.
Right. So let's say Putin decides to deploy a nuclear weapon in, over, or around Ukraine. And of course, the details matter, but let's just start with that. The West has a whole range of options at that point, right? Ranging from immediately surrendering by basically saying, we're not going to give Ukraine any more weapons, and we're going to tell the Ukrainians it's time to capitulate and give Putin whatever he wants, the whole country, right? I don't think that's going to happen, but that's at one end. Right? The other end of the spectrum is all-out nuclear war, right? We basically say, you know what? We've got to respond to this. We know where this is headed, rather than waiting for it, right? If you're going to go, you want to go all in, you want to go first. I don't think that's very likely either, okay? And I want to be absolutely clear about that. The best indication that we have so far is what the West will do in response is probably two things, right? On the one hand, push for negotiations, but on the other hand, probably ramp up the weaponry it's delivering to Ukraine. And so the question then that I have in my mind, if I'm a Russian military planner, is, okay, I use a tactical nuclear weapon. I either demonstrate it up in the atmosphere, I use it against some Ukrainian troops, I blow up a Ukrainian city, whatever. Then what? Right? I think we've all got this idea of once a nuclear weapon is dropped, we stop thinking about the problem. Nuclear weapons don't automatically end the war. So then there still needs to be a strategy on the Russian side, and there still needs to be a strategy on the West side. Mm-hmm. And I don't think there's been enough thinking about that.
Well, let's talk about that. Then what? Then what if Putin in the next month he drops a tactical nuke? Well, first of all, let's talk about where this would potentially happen. Yep. Where would it potentially happen?
I've heard 3 or 4 different scenarios, and we have to say we are guessing. We are speculating. One has been basically the goal is a demonstration of resolve, right? You use a nuclear weapon in a place where it doesn't do too much damage, but it shows, well, maybe you would do it someplace. It's like in the movies where you fire a shot over somebody's head. Mm-hmm. And this would be a burst somewhere in the air, or maybe a burst somewhere over the Black Sea. There's this island called Snake Island that you could more or less blow up and wouldn't really kill too many people. Mm-hmm. That would be number one, demonstration. Number 2 would be you go after a population center, right? Basically, that would be what's called a counter value strike, where you're not actually trying to win the war, but you're trying to coerce them into saying we don't want to fight anymore. And in a way, that's using a tactical nuclear weapon the same way they've used these conventional weapons over the last few days, mm-hmm. which is just kill people mm-hmm. in the middle of cities.
It would also make the land uninhabitable, though, right? I mean, in the sense that if you drop a nuclear weapon there, would it still be an occupiable area for Russia, for instance? It would. There's obviously huge consequences that go with dropping a nuclear weapon. Exactly whether you drop it whether you detonate it on the ground or in the air has a big impact on that. But people still live in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Yeah, they're thriving, in fact, despite the complete destruction of those cities back during World War II.
So there are a lot of scientific factors that go in there. But let's say, right, we know, for example, that if that were to happen, rates of certain kind of cancers would go up, right, over a very long period. Mm-hmm. But then the third way to use them would be actually to accomplish some battlefield goal. That is to say, to take out some formation of Ukrainian troops or equipment. And in theory, at least, that's what these things were originally designed for. That's why they're called tactical, is for tactical use. The problem with that is if you're going to use them in that tactical military sense, one of them accomplishes one tactical objective, right? And so to win the war using tactical nuclear weapons at the tactical level might mean using tens or hundreds of them, right? And now you're talking about something very, very different in terms of what the likely political effects around the world and in Russia are. Mm-hmm. Right? So I think we really need to distinguish between the idea of the nuclear weapon as this sort of magic pill that just by detonating one, all of a sudden everybody gives up, which I don't think is going to happen, mm-hmm. and the nuclear weapon as something you use repeatedly to try to win a war. Mm-hmm. And my personal belief is that the first kind of use is likely to ebb fairly quickly into the second kind of use. Mm-hmm. Unless the Russians really are right and that everybody suddenly says, oh, we're not interested in this war anymore now that Putin's decided he's going to use a nuke. Mm-hmm. Right? So let me ask you this question, right? If Putin decides to, let's say he just uses one as a demonstration effect somewhere, does that make you think, okay, I guess we better give this guy what he wants? Or does that make you think, wow, we have got to show that this is not how business is going to get done in this world?
Mm-hmm. I mean, right? Intuitively is the second one to right. some degree. But the fear there is, does this drag the world into World War III?
So there's a fear on either side, and they're both realistic fears. And this is the problem, is as Putin makes these threats, it narrows the range of options, right, to capitulation, right, appeasement, which has its own question about precedents for the future, right? If Russia says, we can take your land just by threatening to use nuclear weapons, right? What happens with North and South Korea? What happens with China and Taiwan? What happens with any country with nuclear weapons that decides it wants some real estate somewhere, right? Against mm-hmm. a country that doesn't have them. Mm-hmm. But the other side is, I still think that the chances of an escalation to an all-out nuclear war are very small because I don't think NATO or the United States is going to go there.
Mm-hmm.
But what I really don't think is that using one or two nuclear weapons is going to end this war.
Mm-hmm.
And that's that actually scares me more than anything.
Mm-hmm. No, and that's very reasonable. And I just want to get back to your previous point, because there was a tweet from someone named Max Tegmark, who's this very famous AI scientist, physicist, cosmologist, who essentially said that there's now 1 in 6 chance of imminent global nuclear war based on game theory, based on exactly what's happening. And actually, of all people who responded, Sam Harris responded, and he said, "Seems like you're considering only one branch of the decision tree. What are the risks of giving in to nuclear blackmail? One could argue that they might be worse." And then Elon Musk replied to that saying, "Sam, there is such a thing as meditating too much," which is a very trollish thing to say to Sam Harris. But this is just a very weird thing. But Sam Harris made your point, though. He essentially said, like, the risks of giving into this are actually potentially much worse on the world stage.
Right. So first, the 1 out of 6. I love game theory. Game theory is very, very good at demonstrating the nature of a problem. At actually modeling one particular historical situation, what you put into the model is what you put into the model. And so the 1/6 depends not on the game theory, right? It depends on what somebody who made the model decided to enter into the model.
The variables are just too complex.
Right.
The model.
Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis famously said, the chances of nuclear war were between 1 out of 3 and even. Well, is that science? No, that's Kennedy's best guess, and that's this person's best guess.
Mm-hmm.
But the game theory doesn't make his guess any better or any worse, right? My guess is that even Putin doesn't know at this point what he would do. He may think he knows, but we all think we know what we would do in certain situations. And then when we find we're in those situations, we decide, hey, you know what? It might be a better idea just to run away.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
What about the hardliners? You have, this warlord, what's his name? The guy from...
Ramzan Kadyrov.
Yeah, this guy straight out of the Middle Ages. You have him, like all these hardliners who are calling for ramping up the military response from Russia. They did this partial mobilization. It doesn't seem to be going well because they've suffered a lot of battlefield losses since then. So is Putin under a lot of pressure now to escalate to even a greater degree?
Well, I think, the one interpretation, this was the one that the New York Times had in a headline yesterday, is that the reason for these bombings of civilian areas or missile attacks on civilian areas in Ukraine was to placate the hardliners. And after those attacks, and actually after this notoriously vicious general was put in charge of the war effort, Kadyrov came out and basically said, "Okay, now I'm happy." This new general, whose name I'm now going to forget, of course, is in charge, and we've bombed civilians. Mm-hmm. So, and that too, as I said, right, that's a strategy that's not based on actually winning on the battlefield. It's based on trying to raise the cost of the conflict enough so somebody says, "Don't do it." Mm-hmm. Historically, right? Historically, that strategy has almost always failed. And most of our evidence comes from World War II, but we also know about the amount. The United States dumped more ordnance on Vietnam than we dumped in all of World War II. It did not make those people want to capitulate. It made them want to fight harder. Iraq, same kind of thing. But in World War II, the Germans bombed England. The English got mad. The English bombed the Germans kept at it. The only really example of this kind of bombing we have working is the case of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But at that point, Japan had largely already lost the war anyhow. Mm-hmm. So we don't know, right? We are what makes this so scary is that we're in uncharted territory. Mm-hmm. I was talking back and forth with this reporter from the Washington Post last week about sort of what is the precedent for this kind of thing. And I said, we haven't had anything like this before.
Mm-hmm. We're in definitely brand new territory here. Yep. And so I know a lot of people have been, saying various things, and really they're making various predictions. We don't know where it's headed. But that's why everybody's kind of on the edge of their seats here, because like the potential is, people have in their mind, is it World War III? Is it just the biggest conflict in Europe that we'll ever see? Or is it going to lead to much worse down the line? We're going to continue discussing this, Paul. I have some follow-up questions for you in a moment. I'm just going to take a break right here.
Okay.